Before he was 30 years old, Alexander the Great had already changed the ancient world. He defeated powerful armies, conquered enormous territories, and created an empire stretching from Greece and Egypt deep into Asia. But Alexander's story isn't simply about winning battles. It's also about ambition, leadership, intelligence, courage, and what can happen when the desire for greatness has no clear limit. Hello everyone, I'm Clara and welcome back. Today we're going to discover the extraordinary life of Alexander the Great, from his childhood in ancient Macedonia to his rise as one of history's most famous military leaders. While following his story, you'll also improve your English listening, expand your vocabulary, and learn useful expressions naturally through context. We'll explore his life through 5 chapters. Chapter number 1, The Boy Who Was Raised to Become a King. Chapter number 2, Becoming King at Only 20. Chapter number 3, The Conquest of the Persian Empire. Chapter number 4, Alexander at the Edge of the Known World. Chapter number 5, His Mysterious Death and Extraordinary Legacy. Alexander conquered much of the world known to him, but could he ever conquer his own ambition? Let's find out. Before we continue, I have something that might really help you. If you're enjoying these lessons but sometimes feel like you need more practice, more structure, or someone to guide you personally, I've created the complete English fluency system just for that. Inside, you'll find everything organized in one place: premium lessons, English books, worksheets, speaking practice, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and much more. No more jumping from one random video to another. And the best part? You're not learning alone. Whenever you have a question or need help, you can contact me directly. I'll be there to support you throughout your English journey. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced learner, this program will help you build real confidence and make consistent progress. If that sounds like what you've been looking for, you'll find the link in the description. Now, let's get back to today's lesson. Chapter number 1, The Boy Who Was Raised to Become a King. Long before Alexander became the Great, he was simply a young prince growing up in the kingdom of Macedonia. He was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the Macedonian capital. His father was King Philip II, an ambitious ruler who transformed Macedonia into the strongest military power in Greece. His mother, Olympias, was a powerful influence in Alexander's early life. From childhood, Alexander grew up surrounded by politics, soldiers, competition, and stories about legendary heroes. This wasn't an ordinary childhood. Alexander knew that one day he might become king, and everyone around him knew it too. Here's a useful English expression: have big shoes to fill. Native speakers use this expression when someone is expected to match the achievements of an important or successful person who came before them. For example, after becoming CEO of his father's company, he knew he had big shoes to fill. Alexander certainly had big shoes to fill. His father was an extraordinary military reformer. Philip had reorganized the Macedonian army, expanded his kingdom, and developed a powerful military system built around disciplined infantry and long spears known as sarissas. But Alexander wasn't interested in simply becoming another king. Even as a young man, he seemed fascinated by the idea of greatness. One famous story from his youth involves a horse named Bucephalus. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, the horse was extremely difficult to control. Experienced men tried to ride him but failed. Alexander noticed something they hadn't. The horse appeared to be frightened by its own shadow. So Alexander reportedly turned Bucephalus toward the sun, preventing the animal from seeing the shadow clearly. Then he climbed onto the horse and successfully rode him. Whether every detail of the story happened exactly as later writers described is difficult to know. Ancient biographies often mixed history with dramatic storytelling. But the story became famous because it represented something people associated with Alexander throughout his life. He looked at problems differently. Instead of asking, "Why can't this horse be controlled?" he apparently asked, "What is making the horse afraid?" That's a powerful distinction. Here's another useful English expression: think on your feet. It means to react quickly and intelligently when you're dealing with an unexpected situation. For example, a good leader needs to think on their feet when a plan suddenly changes. Alexander would need that ability many times later in life. But military training wasn't the only important part of his education. When Alexander was a teenager, his father arranged for him to study under one of history's most famous philosophers, Aristotle. Alexander studied subjects such as philosophy, literature, medicine, science, and politics. One work had a particularly strong influence on him: Homer's Iliad. Alexander admired the legendary warrior Achilles and reportedly carried a copy of the Iliad during his campaigns. This tells us something important about him. Alexander didn't see military achievement simply as a job. He seems to have imagined himself as part of a much larger historical story. He wanted glory. He wanted his name to survive long after his death. And that desire would become one of the strongest forces driving his future conquests. Alexander also received practical experience unusually early. At around 16, while Philip was away campaigning, Alexander was entrusted with responsibilities in Macedonia. Not long afterward, he gained battlefield experience alongside his father. By the time he reached adulthood, he had studied philosophy with Aristotle, learned warfare from Philip, and grown up believing that extraordinary achievement was expected of him. But Alexander's relationship with his father wasn't always simple. Philip's political marriages and decisions created tension within the royal family. Macedonia's royal court could be dangerous, and questions about succession carried enormous consequences. Then, in 336 BCE, everything changed. King Philip II was assassinated. Alexander was only 20 years old. Suddenly, the young prince who had spent his childhood preparing for power actually had it. But becoming king and remaining king were two very different things. Enemies were watching. Rebellions threatened Macedonia's control over Greece. And powerful rivals could easily have seen Alexander's youth as weakness. At 20 years old, Alexander faced the first great test of his life. Would Philip's empire begin to collapse, or would the young king prove that he was even more ambitious than his father? The answer would soon shock the ancient world. Chapter number 2: Becoming king at only 20. Imagine being 20 years old and suddenly discovering that thousands of soldiers, powerful generals, political rivals, and an entire kingdom are now looking to you for leadership. That's what happened to Alexander in 336 BCE. After the assassination of his father, Philip II, Alexander became king of Macedonia. But the crown didn't automatically give him security. In fact, it gave him problems. Some people believed Alexander was too young. Others saw Philip's death as an opportunity to challenge Macedonian power. Several Greek states hoped they might finally escape Macedonia's control. Alexander had inherited a kingdom, but first he had to prove that he could keep it. Here's a useful English expression: rise to the occasion. Native speakers use this expression when someone performs well during a difficult or important situation. For example, everyone was nervous before the presentation, but Maria rose to the occasion and delivered an excellent speech. Alexander certainly needed to rise to the occasion. Instead of waiting for his enemies to become stronger, he moved quickly. He secured his position in Macedonia and demonstrated to neighboring peoples and Greek states that the new king wasn't going to be easily intimidated. Then, in 335 BCE, Alexander received serious news. The Greek city of Thebes had rebelled against Macedonian control. This was a dangerous moment. If Alexander appeared weak, other Greek cities might join the rebellion. So he responded with extraordinary speed. Alexander marched south and confronted Thebes. The city was captured and largely destroyed, and many of its inhabitants were killed or enslaved. It was a brutal warning. Other Greek states understood the message immediately. Alexander might have been young, but he wasn't politically or militarily weak. With Greece under control, he could finally turn his attention toward the enormous project his father had been preparing before his death: the invasion of the Persian Empire. At the time, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was one of the largest and most powerful empires on Earth. It stretched across huge areas of the ancient world. Conquering it sounded almost impossible. But in 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with a Macedonian-led army. He was about 22 years old. Think about that for a moment. At an age when many people today are still deciding what career they want, Alexander was beginning a campaign against a superpower. One of his first major battles against Persian forces took place at the Granicus River. The fighting was dangerous, and Alexander personally participated in combat. Ancient accounts describe moments when his life was at serious risk, but his forces won. That victory was important for more than military reasons. It gave his soldiers confidence. They had entered Persian territory, faced powerful opposition, and survived. Here's another useful English expression: prove yourself. It means to demonstrate through your actions that you're capable or worthy. For example, she was the youngest person on the team, but she quickly proved herself. Alexander had spent his childhood preparing to lead. Now he was proving himself on real battlefields. But his leadership style was unusual. He didn't simply stay far behind his soldiers and give commands. Alexander often fought close to the action. That made him vulnerable, but it also helped create extraordinary loyalty among many of his troops. His soldiers could see that their king was sharing the danger with them. Of course, courage alone doesn't explain Alexander's success. He had inherited an exceptionally effective military system from Philip II. His army combined different forces in coordinated ways. The Macedonian phalanx could hold enemy formations in place with its long sarissas, while Alexander's elite cavalry could attack vulnerable points. In simple English, Alexander didn't always try to defeat the entire enemy army at once. He looked for the place where one decisive attack could change the whole battle. That's an important leadership lesson. Sometimes success isn't about having unlimited strength. It's about knowing where to use the strength you have. And Alexander was remarkably good at recognizing those moments. But the Persian Empire hadn't truly been defeated yet. Its ruler, Darius III, still commanded enormous resources. Soon, Alexander wouldn't be fighting regional Persian forces. He would face the Persian king himself. The young Macedonian king had crossed into Asia looking for conquest. Now he was moving toward a confrontation that could determine the future of two empires. And after that, there would be no easy way back. Chapter number 3: The Conquest of the Persian Empire. By now, Alexander had won important victories. But defeating local Persian forces was one thing. Defeating the ruler of the Persian Empire himself was something completely different. That ruler was Darius III, and in 333 BCE, the two kings finally faced each other at the Battle of Issus. Alexander's army was smaller than the Persian force described by ancient sources, although historians debate the exact numbers. What mattered was that Alexander was fighting deep inside enemy territory against a king with enormous resources. For Alexander, this wasn't simply another battle. It was a test of whether his invasion could survive. Here's a useful English expression: the stakes are high. Native speakers use this expression when the possible consequences of a situation are extremely important. For example, the stakes are high because losing this contract could seriously hurt the company. At Issus, the stakes couldn't have been much higher. The battlefield was relatively narrow, which limited the Persian army's ability to use its size effectively. Alexander saw an opportunity. Rather than attacking without direction, he concentrated his forces and personally led his companion cavalry against the Persian line. The battle became intense. Then, Alexander's forces broke through. Darius fled. Once the Persian king left the battlefield, his army eventually collapsed. Alexander had achieved an extraordinary victory. But what happened afterward tells us something fascinating about ancient warfare. Darius had left members of his royal family behind, including his mother, wife, and children. According to ancient accounts, Alexander treated them with respect rather than humiliating them. This wasn't necessarily just kindness, it was also politics. Alexander was beginning to behave not simply like an invader, but like a man who expected to replace Darius as ruler. That's an important distinction. He didn't only want Persian territory. Increasingly, he wanted the Persian throne. After Issus, Alexander didn't immediately chase Darius. Instead, he continued south along the eastern Mediterranean. One of the greatest obstacles in his path was the wealthy city of Tyre. Tyre was located on an island just off the coast and protected by strong walls. Capturing it seemed extremely difficult. So Alexander did something remarkable. His forces constructed a causeway from the mainland toward the island, while naval forces also helped attack the city. The siege lasted for months. Eventually, in 332 BCE, Tyre fell. The aftermath was extremely harsh, with many inhabitants killed or enslaved. Alexander's campaigns produced extraordinary achievements, but they also brought enormous suffering. That's important to remember when studying historical conquerors. Military brilliance and human cost can exist in the same story. Here's another useful English expression: at any cost. It means being determined to achieve something regardless of how difficult or costly it becomes. For example, he wanted to win at any cost, even if it damaged his relationships. Alexander's determination could sometimes look exactly like that. After continuing south, he entered Egypt, where Persian rule was unpopular in some quarters. Alexander was accepted as ruler and was crowned according to Egyptian traditions. While there, he founded a city that would become one of the most famous cities of the ancient world, Alexandria. Alexandria eventually became a major center of trade, scholarship, and culture. But Alexander wasn't finished. Darius III was still alive, and the Persian Empire still controlled enormous territories. In 331 BCE, the two kings met again near Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. This would become one of Alexander's most famous victories. Darius had prepared carefully. The battlefield offered more open space than Issus, which could benefit Persian cavalry. Alexander needed discipline, timing, and coordination. During the battle, he maneuvered his forces in ways that helped create an opening in the Persian formation. Then, he attacked. Alexander and his cavalry drove toward the center. Once again, Darius eventually fled the battlefield. This time, the consequences were enormous. The road to the heart of the Persian Empire was open. Alexander entered major imperial centers, including Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, Alexander gained access to enormous royal wealth. Later, parts of the palace complex were burned. Ancient sources disagree about exactly why this happened. Some presented it as revenge for earlier Persian attacks on Greece. Others described a more impulsive episode. Whatever the exact motivation, the symbolism was powerful. The young king of Macedonia had reached one of the greatest centers of Persian power. The empire Alexander had once invaded was becoming his. But Darius was still alive. Alexander continued pursuing him eastward. Then, in 330 BCE, Darius was killed by men from his own side as Alexander approached. Alexander had lost the enemy he had spent years trying to defeat. But strangely, he didn't celebrate Darius's death as simply the destruction of an enemy. According to the historical tradition, Alexander arranged for Darius to receive royal burial honors. Why? Because Alexander was no longer presenting himself merely as the king who defeated Persia. He was presenting himself as Darius's legitimate successor. And that's when Alexander's story began to change. The goal had once been defeating Persia. Now Persia was largely his. So what was left to conquer? For most people, that would have been enough. For Alexander, it wasn't. Instead of returning home, he looked farther east, toward Central Asia, toward India, toward lands many of his soldiers had never imagined seeing. Alexander had conquered an empire, but his greatest enemy might no longer have been Darius. It might have been his inability to decide when enough was finally enough. Chapter number 4. Alexander at the edge of the known world. Alexander had achieved what once seemed impossible. The Persian Empire had fallen. Darius III was dead. Alexander controlled enormous territories stretching from Macedonia and Greece through Egypt and deep into Asia. For most rulers, this would have been the moment to stop, return home, celebrate, strengthen the empire. But Alexander wasn't most rulers. Instead of turning west, he continued east. And this decision reveals one of the most fascinating and troubling parts of his personality. Alexander didn't seem satisfied with victory. Every conquered land revealed another land beyond it. Every achievement created another ambition. Here's a useful English expression: push the limits. Native speakers use this expression when someone tries to go beyond what is considered normal, safe, or possible. For example, great athletes constantly push the limits of what their bodies can do. Alexander had been pushing the limits for years. After the fall of the Persian Empire, he campaigned through parts of Central Asia, including regions corresponding to modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and nearby areas. These campaigns were different from his earlier battles. There wasn't always one enormous enemy army waiting for him. Instead, Alexander faced difficult terrain, local resistance, and opponents who could attack and disappear. The war became exhausting. Alexander had to adapt. And although he continued winning, the campaigns became increasingly costly. Something else was changing too. Alexander wasn't behaving simply like a Macedonian king anymore. He began adopting some Persian customs. He wore elements of Persian royal clothing. He included Persian nobles in his administration. Later, he encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persian women. Alexander appeared to be trying to rule a multicultural empire rather than simply placing Macedonia above everyone else. That sounds surprisingly modern in some ways, but to many Macedonians, it was deeply uncomfortable. They had followed Alexander to defeat Persia. Now their king seemed increasingly interested in becoming a Persian-style ruler himself. Here's another useful English expression: a double-edged sword. It describes something that has both advantages and disadvantages. For example, technology can be a double-edged sword. It connects us, but it can also distract us. Alexander's attempt to combine cultures was a double-edged sword. It could help him govern his enormous empire, but it also created tension with the soldiers and officers who had helped him build it. His relationship with some of his closest companions became increasingly difficult. One particularly tragic incident involved Clytus the Black, an officer who had fought alongside Alexander and had reportedly saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus. During a drinking party in 328 BCE, Alexander and Clytus began arguing. The argument became increasingly heated. Clytus criticized Alexander and praised the achievements of Philip II. Alexander became furious. In the confrontation, Alexander killed Clytus. Afterward, ancient accounts describe Alexander as deeply remorseful. It was a terrible example of how quickly anger, pride, and power could become destructive. The young king, who had once shown extraordinary self-control on the battlefield, couldn't always control himself. And that contrast matters. You can conquer cities, you can defeat armies, you can command thousands of people. But controlling your own emotions can still be one of life's hardest battles. Alexander continued east. Eventually, in 327 BCE, his forces entered the Indian subcontinent. There, he faced another powerful ruler, King Porus. In 326 BCE, their armies met at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in the region of modern Pakistan. Porus's army included something Alexander's soldiers found especially challenging: war elephants. Alexander had faced many different enemies before, but elephants created a new tactical problem. Once again, he adapted. After a difficult battle, Alexander defeated Porus. According to ancient accounts, Alexander was impressed by the defeated king's courage and allowed him to continue ruling his territory under Alexander's authority. It was another example of Alexander understanding that sometimes the smartest way to control a conquered land wasn't to destroy its leadership, but to work with it. Then came the moment Alexander couldn't overcome with military strategy. His own soldiers said, no. They had been campaigning for years. They had crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, entire empires. Many hadn't seen Macedonia for nearly a decade. When Alexander wanted to continue farther east at the Hyphasis River, his exhausted troops refused. Imagine that moment. Alexander had faced the Persian Empire and won. He had defeated kings, captured cities, crossed enormous distances. But now, he was defeated by the exhaustion of his own men. Here's a useful English expression: reach your breaking point. It means to reach the moment when you can no longer tolerate a difficult situation. For example, after months of working without proper rest, she finally reached her breaking point. Alexander's soldiers had reached theirs. Alexander reportedly withdrew to his tent and waited, hoping they would change their minds. They didn't. Eventually, he accepted the decision. The army turned back. But the journey home wasn't easy. Alexander led part of his forces through the Gadrosian Desert, an extremely difficult route through what is now southern Iran and Pakistan. Many people died from exhaustion, hunger, thirst, and harsh conditions. By the time Alexander returned toward the heart of his empire, he had traveled farther than almost any Macedonian army before him. He had pushed his soldiers and himself to extraordinary limits. But Alexander was still only in his early 30s. He wasn't planning retirement. He was already thinking about future campaigns and how to organize his enormous empire. Then, in Babylon, everything suddenly changed. The man who had survived countless battles was about to face something his army couldn't defeat. And at only 32 years old, Alexander the Great was running out of time. Chapter number 5. his mysterious death and extraordinary legacy. In 323 BCE, Alexander arrived in Babylon. He was only 32 years old. Think about everything he had already accomplished. He had become king at 20, defeated the Persian Empire, ruled Egypt, marched through Central Asia, reached the Indian subcontinent, founded or renamed numerous cities, with Alexandria in Egypt becoming the most famous. And yet, Alexander still wasn't finished. He was reportedly preparing for new military campaigns, including plans connected with Arabia. For Alexander, there always seemed to be another horizon, another territory, another challenge. Then suddenly, the conqueror became seriously ill. Ancient accounts describe Alexander developing a fever after days of drinking and social events in Babylon. His condition gradually became worse. His generals and soldiers waited, but Alexander wasn't recovering. The man who had survived arrows, swords, dangerous battles, exhausting marches, and assassination threats was now lying in bed, unable to command his army. Here's a useful English expression: take a turn for the worse. Native speakers use this expression when a situation, especially someone's condition, suddenly becomes more serious. For example, he seemed to be recovering, but unfortunately, his condition took a turn for the worse. Alexander's condition continued deteriorating. Eventually, in June 323 BCE, he died. He hadn't even reached his 33rd birthday. And almost immediately, a question appeared that historians are still discussing more than 2,000 years later. What killed Alexander the Great? The simple answer is, we don't know for certain. Several explanations have been proposed over the centuries. Some historians have considered illnesses such as malaria or typhoid fever. Other medical explanations have also been suggested. Ancient writers also preserved rumors that Alexander had been poisoned, but there isn't enough reliable evidence to prove a poisoning theory. That's an important lesson when studying history. A mysterious story isn't automatically a true story. When the evidence is incomplete, sometimes the most accurate answer is simply, we don't know. Here's another useful English expression: leave behind. In this context, it means to create something that continues to exist or influence people after you're gone. For example, the scientist left behind discoveries that changed modern medicine. And Alexander certainly left behind an enormous legacy, but he also left behind an enormous problem. Who would rule his empire? Alexander had created one of the largest empires of the ancient world, but he hadn't created a clear and stable system for transferring power after his death. Ancient traditions give different details about his final wishes, and the succession quickly became disputed. His generals began competing for control. These successors are often known as the Diadochi, meaning successors. They fought a series of wars. Eventually, Alexander's empire broke apart into several major kingdoms. This reveals one of the great contradictions of Alexander's life. He was extraordinarily successful at conquering an empire, but building an empire that could remain united without him proved much more difficult. However, Alexander's political empire didn't need to survive as one state for his influence to continue. His conquests transformed the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Greek language and culture spread much farther east. At the same time, Greek settlers encountered Egyptian, Persian, Mesopotamian, Central Asian, and other cultures. Ideas traveled, trade expanded, artistic traditions influenced one another. New centers of learning and commerce developed. Historians call the period that followed Alexander's conquests the Hellenistic Age, and this may be Alexander's most important long-term legacy. Not simply the territory he conquered, but the connections his conquests helped create between different parts of the ancient world. Alexandria in Egypt became an especially important example. In the generations after Alexander, the city developed into a major center of scholarship and trade under the Ptolemaic dynasty. Its famous library became legendary. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, literature, and philosophy there. Alexander never lived to see Alexandria become everything it eventually became, yet the city carried his name and his historical influence for centuries. So was Alexander truly great? That's more complicated than the nickname suggests. From a military perspective, his achievements were extraordinary. He repeatedly defeated powerful opponents. He inspired remarkable loyalty among many soldiers. He adapted to different battlefields. And he created an empire of astonishing size in little more than a decade. But conquest also came with enormous human suffering. Cities were destroyed. People were killed or enslaved. His ambition pushed his army through years of warfare and extreme hardship. And as his power increased, some episodes of his reign reveal increasing tension, violence, and conflict with people close to him. History rarely gives us simple heroes and villains. Real people are usually more complicated. Here's one final useful English expression: stand the test of time. It means to remain important, respected, or remembered for a very long period. For example, some ancient works of literature have stood the test of time and are still read today. Alexander's name has certainly stood the test of time. More than 2,000 years after his death, we still study him, we still debate him, we still ask how someone so young could accomplish so much. But perhaps the most interesting lesson from Alexander's life isn't about warfare, it's about ambition. Ambition can push people beyond what they thought was possible. It can make someone work harder, think bigger, and refuse to accept ordinary limits. But ambition without limits can also become dangerous. Alexander conquered kingdom after kingdom, yet there was always another destination, another battle, another horizon. So perhaps his story leaves us with a question rather than an answer. How much is enough? Success matters, dreams matter, ambition matters, but knowing what you're building, why you're building it, and when achievement has become obsession, matters too. Alexander lived only 32 years, yet in that short lifetime, he changed the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world. His empire didn't survive intact, but his influence did. And that's why, more than 2,000 years later, the young king from Macedonia is still remembered by the name history gave him, Alexander the Great.